You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 50. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. What gets in the way of disciple making? So I've been rereading several of Brené Brown's books and the work that she has done and the research that she has done around courageous, daring leadership. And I've been having conversations with Tim about those books again. And I think, Tim, you've read most of her books or listened to them.
I have and have learned a lot. And as I listened to in our conversations, I learn from you.
Let's hope that I'm a good translator. We started asking ourselves a question around what behavior in church culture stands in the way of courageous leadership. And so today we want to walk through a baker's dozen list of possibilities around the behavior and church cultures that we see that could get in the way of courageous leadership. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, and as we walk through the list, what we hope that you'll consider is how many of the behaviors and church culture reflect the church that you lead. And you'll have to trust us that by the time we get to the end, there is good news on the other side of this list, because it's not necessarily a fun list, I would say. If you're willing to engage, if you're willing to do the work. And so you may be saying, but Sarah, you asked the question, what gets in the way of disciple making? And why are you now talking about courageous leadership? And what I would say is we need courage to focus on our mission of disciple making. Now, as Tim and I were preparing for this, Tim had a good point.
Sarah, I am convinced that one of the biggest barriers to disciple making in the church is that we have people who are trying to lead the church who themselves aren't followers of Jesus. So an assumption that we're making throughout this podcast, and maybe over the next several podcasts, is that we're disciples. We're followers of Jesus. We're Jesus followers and leading a congregation as Jesus followers. So I'm going to be as bold as to say, if you are not a follower of Jesus, it's going to be difficult to listen to what we're ready to say.
So here's the question. What behavior and church culture stands in the way of courageous leadership? And here's why we're asking this question, because what stands in the way often becomes the way. And I would say that many of these behaviors have become the way. And because they have become the way, we've lost our way and perhaps have not been making disciples. And that's why we felt the need to say what Tim shared. Not going to make sense if you're not a disciple of Jesus. So, enough of an introduction. Here is our list.
The first thing that gets in the way is avoiding tough conversations. How many of us as leaders have been in the place of knowing that we've had a staff member or leader of the of congregation where we've needed to have a conversation which helps us move beyond a certain point, but we're hesitant in having that conversation. Whether it's fear, whether it's the desire to be liked, whether we don't want to make anyone angry. I've heard people say over the years, one of the reasons they don't have tough conversations is we don't want to make those people mad. We don't want to make those people angry. That's part of what's behind that question. or the list of avoiding the tough conversations. I think there may be some other things you want to add.
So here are a few examples. Tim's already laid the foundation, and these are not specific examples from specific churches by any stretch of the imagination, but there's situations that we've heard happening. Tim's named a couple. Here are a few more. The average age of your congregation is over 70. And nobody's having the tough conversation that the whole congregation is in the last phase of your life. Guess what that means, folks? It means sooner rather than later, the end of life is going to come for that church as well. Or try this one on. Your entire budget is going to building maintenance, utilities, and the pastor's compensation package, and you have no resources to engage in ministry. So anything that is given is supporting a pastor and the building, and nothing more can happen. Now, I would say the tough conversation around that is, what makes us a church?
That would be a tough conversation. Even if we're talking about what makes us a church, if we could think of it even positively, of what kind of legacy do we want to leave, we would have to have the conversation about, well, does that mean we're going to be the last people here? I would say a tough conversation that we must have today is inappropriate use of social media in our churches.
So another one might be a tough conversation would be a conversation with a chairperson who seems to be standing in the way of every decision to either adapt to the changes that are happening around you or moving the church forward in some way, shape, or form. But the leaders of the church are afraid to replace him or her because they know what their financial giving is to the church. So in essence, a leader is holding the church hostage for their agenda. The leverage there is financial. So tough conversations. This is one area that a set of behaviors, we've given you some examples that can stand in the way of courageous leadership. So what's the second one?
Well, another one might be just being nice or polite.
And I've heard you talk about this one a lot. And so you...
Well, I don't say it. I'm not very nice when I say it, because I say we've just about niced ourselves out of existence. Instead of talking about being kind, we talk about being nice. We cower away from the tough conversations because we feel the only thing left to say are just the pleasantries. So we talk about the weather and we don't want to offend anyone. And certainly any conversation that we would have around making disciples, if it becomes offensive, we've gotten to the place where talking about Jesus is, we feel like, is narrow-minded. So we don't want to offend anybody by talking about Jesus. So we're just being nice and polite. And certainly, can't we all just get along with each other, which is not necessarily being Christian.
I think one of the ways that I see this one getting in the way of courageous leadership is if we're only being nice to one another or polite to one another. So we greet one another on Sunday morning, we shake one another's hands, and then we turn around and have a conversation with our friends or with our spouse that really needs to be happening with the person that we just shook their hand, but weren't willing to say, hey, could we meet sometime this week? There's something that I need to have a conversation with you about. And so we're not able, again, to move forward. Moving on to number 3.
Passive aggressive behavior.
Yeah, and this is one that really corrodes trust and also engagement. I think this is one that sometimes we have a hard time naming what the behavior is, but people can smell it. They smell that something's wrong, or people aren't, I've heard it described as people are being childish, and really it's passive aggressive behavior. So saying one thing to the pastor's face and another thing to your best friend, not giving to the church general fund, but designating your giving and saying, I'm not going to give to the church, general church fund until XYZ happens. Oh yeah, here's one that's passive aggressiveness, or maybe it's its own. I'm not really sure. You can decide. Undermining the leadership of the church by gossiping. Now, you and I might say, well, who would gossip in the church? And what I would say to that is, I think people think it comes off as innocent, but when folks don't have the full story about something, an equally harmful form of gossip is making up what you don't know. And so let's say the pastor's out for a Sunday and you don't know why. So you tell somebody that there's something wrong with their kids, only because you heard that their kids had something happen at school. And that had nothing to do with it. They had vacation planned, but you're making up stories. So all of those are what I would categorize as passive aggressiveness. There are probably other examples.
But it stands in the way of making disciples. I don't. Well,
and so I think why these things stand in the way of making disciples is because they become the point. Instead of being able to focus on the mission of making disciples and helping people to encounter Jesus and leading people to Jesus and sending people out to serve and deepening our faith, we get caught up in conversations that shouldn't need to happen. So now someone is designating their giving instead of giving to the general fund. And we're going to have to take our time to have a conversation with someone about what's going on there and what's the source of it and why is it happening. And hear me, there may be times that there's a very good reason for designated giving. So please don't hear me say all designated giving is passive aggressive behavior. I am not saying that at all. There are times that I fully understand why that happens. I'm saying that in this instance, a decision was made that someone doesn't like, so they decide to designate their giving. So your energy and focus is then turned away from the tasks that focus on disciple making.
Yeah, I would say one of the passive aggressive behaviors is what I would call, and I think Edwin Friedman called it this, and that is seduction and sabotage, where we're saying one thing to give support, but yet behind the scenes, we kind of pull the rug out from under things. That's part of what I understand the passive aggressive behavior is, because in the group we want to feel like, or have people feel like that we're all on board, but then behind the scenes we make sure it doesn't happen.
And another expression of that may be what we listed as the fourth one, and that's the parking lot meeting. Where I think seduction and sabotage also happens. So decisions are made in a meeting and agreement is come to around the table. And then after the meeting, another meeting takes place out in the parking lot. And then you have something different to say and come to a different conclusion. And because you just made a different decision that you like better in the parking lot. That's what you tell people has happened instead of the conversation that really happened in the meeting. It's another form of seduction and sabotage.
You and I both have experienced that in a kind of way that where I tried to deal with that one time was making sure that everybody had an opportunity to say something about a decision and just say to them, if you don't take an opportunity to say it now, you can't talk about it in the parking lot.
Right.
Because what we were doing, it would stand in the way of trying to move us forward. And so we tried to put a system in place so that the conversations were had in the room. And the trust was that if somebody wanted to talk about it in the parking lot, somebody else would say, you had an opportunity.
Right.
So I know that we're just talking about the barriers at this point, but I thought that was one way to address that.
So another behavior or church culture that gets in the way of disciple making is during seasons of change, we fail to acknowledge our fears and our feelings. Some of the change that is natural change in the life of the church is a new pastor is coming, or this coming year, you're going to be sharing a pastor with another church for the first time. And people are wondering, are we still going to be cared for? Are we going to have to change our worship time? Or change is happening around the community, and that means that there's been change in the life of the local congregation, and your finances are lower than they have been, and at the same time, costs are going up, and people are moving away, and you might not even live in the neighborhood any longer, and it's harder and harder to get there. And so you begin to wonder what's going to happen when we don't come and our friends don't come, but nobody's talking about it. Or people stop giving and stop attending, and the budget gets reduced instead of having a conversation about why that's happening. In other words, you fail to acknowledge the fears and feelings that lead you to manage the problem behaviors instead of addressing the actual fears and feelings. So we're focused on the symptoms instead of getting to the root of the problem. But we act as if our fears and the way that we're feeling, nobody else is feeling it or afraid of it. And the reality is most of the people around are thinking the same things, but nobody's talking about it.
And because we don't talk about it, that leads us then to a disconnection and a lack of empathy, a disconnection with one another, the community, and even understanding how we feel and then how others feel. That's what you just said, but that's number 6. That's another barrier.
That's number 6. And so that lack of connection and empathy leads to eroding trust.
When we don't trust one another, then and the disconnect, when we don't trust one another, we begin then to protect ourselves, which means we pull inward. So any connection then we have with the community begins to be jeopardized. So the tough conversations of, if we're making disciples, we're connected to the community. If we're not connected to the community, who's leading the conversation of why we're not connected, or how do we get connected?
Right. And so relationships end up suffering. And so if there's not connection between people, if there's not connection between the church and the community, it's hard to care when you don't have connection. And those create a barrier to disciple making. The next one could be considered too, but I'm going to bring them together. We either fear failure or have been ridiculed or ignored, so we stop trying. And what that means is We no longer create new ministry or respond to the changes that happen around us, or pause to think about how we might respond to the changes around us in innovative ways. And then that leads us to settling for the status quo and groupthink. I have been in church meetings that I have heard people defer to the opinion of one person, and would say things like, "Well, whatever he wants, that's what we'll do," or "Whatever she wants, that's what we'll do," and everybody sits around the table and kind of shrugs and and nobody says anything because they're afraid that it might not work, afraid because what they tried, it failed, or you're just afraid of failure, period. So that's number 7.
So sometimes that surfaces by saying, well, we tried that once before. If we try something new, we tried that once before and it didn't work.
And it was 40 years ago.
And it was at maybe just 39. The other thing that happens with that is sometimes when we have new leadership, like new clergy leadership, and that person comes and offers a different way of doing something, this surfaces with words like, "Was there something wrong with the way we've been doing it?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something wrong with us because you want to do it differently?" I think that comes out of that fear of failure, or the idea that we'll be ridiculed, or we like what we're doing, the status quo. We wouldn't call it that, but we like the way we're doing it, and if we change, then we're going to have to do it differently.
Number 8, we are defined by setbacks and disappointments. And so this results in spending an inordinate amount of time reassuring people about their contribution and value instead of focusing on the healing and wholeness that needs to happen. So a congregation that I served as an associate pastor, there was an embezzlement. And I can think back to that time and the amount of energy that the staff spent reassuring the folks who were involved in the finances of the church and the leadership of the church that their contribution was valued. And yes, I'm using contribution in multiple ways there. Both what they had given to the church financially as well as their leadership. And that needed to happen, but we didn't focus on the healing that needed to happen until some other things changed, because we were spending all of the time focusing on reassuring people. Now, my hope is that no one listening to this has ever experienced or will ever experience something that dramatic. A setback and a disappointment does not have to be that dramatic. It could be something as simple as we had a horrible recruiting season for Sunday school teachers, and what are we going to do? That's a disappointment. Yeah, we're disappointed that we didn't have people respond. So it doesn't have to be a big dramatic thing. So what's number 9?
Shame and blame. The way that surfaces for me, and the reason we don't have the conversation, is that if we're embarrassed about something that we've done or feel like we've been put in our place, as easy as being dismissed, we will not enter into the conversation because we've been put in our place.
And blame comes up as simple as pointing a finger at somebody else and saying it's not my responsibility, and never stopping to ask the question, what's my part in it? And even when we don't think that we have a part, if you're a leader, we all contribute something to that. And so pointing fingers in other directions without saying, here's what I might have done differently. Blame results, and shame and blame get in the way of disciple making.
Just a personal experience, which it may not seem like it would have been anything about shame, but wanting to have people respond positively to who we are, and I'll say I wanted that to happen to me. It entered a new congregation, had been there only a few weeks, and really trying to develop the relationships and have people respond positively. Being greeted at the door once and being said, "We'll not be back," because we used to hear about grace and now we hear about Jesus. That seems strange, but I really felt like there was something wrong with me at that point.
Right.
And I did not have at that point in my ministry, I did not have a conversation with the couple who was saying that. I have internalized it, even to the point where it's showing up now on a podcast.
But that shame, we think that we're bad in that situation, that we've done something.
Well, I've never apologized for Jesus, and I'm not going to apologize for Jesus.
Right.
So, but the other part of that is the only way I know grace is through Jesus. And so I was really kind of confused. I internalized it as shame, which then leads to another one. And I think this is part of what it is about being like too. And that is, we fear looking stupid or saying something wrong about hot topics. So we don't say anything at all. Or if what we do say, we make sure that we're saying it with people who agree with us or with whom we can agree. So we may not say the same thing at the same time at different places with different groups of people. We may become more chameleons at times, which makes it very difficult to have tough conversations.
So we pretend when marriages are falling apart that marriages are okay.
Right.
We pretend that divorce hasn't happened when all of a sudden couples aren't showing up together at worship. They're showing up at two different worship services or only one of them showing up. We pretend that addiction isn't present in the lives of the people who are a part of the congregation, or that a child hasn't failed out of school, or that your in-laws haven't declared bankruptcy, or the pastor's child isn't gay. We deny those things and we don't talk about them. We don't have any conversation because we fear looking stupid or saying something. All of that gets in the way of disciple making.
Of making disciples.
So number 11 is rushing to quick fixes without diagnosing the root cause.
Well, we've kind of talked about that one a lot over these podcasts, in that we want a quick answer without knowing our context, understanding the situations that we're in, so we can go off and see how it works someplace else and come back and try to do the same thing in our place and then blame everybody else when it doesn't work.
So here's one that I think people perceive as a quick fix, and it misses the root cause of what's going on. You're sending us a pastor who's married with children? So now our congregation is going to have a whole bunch of young people. Now, it's wonderful that you're getting a pastor who has children, but that doesn't address the root cause of why haven't families been participating in the life of the church. If I'm totally making this up, but not really, if the average age of the congregation is in their 70s and all of a sudden now you have a young pastor with children, and you think that that's going to fix something that has been going on for years, you're not addressing the root cause. throwing money at a program and saying, well, we'll give it a weekend and that's going to fix everything. And now we're going to have a congregation filled with disciples isn't the root cause. Okay, move us on, Tim.
Well, I was just going to say, if we had a younger pastor who had lots of energy, we could do anything. So we don't articulate the behaviors that reflect our values. So as a result, we don't teach the values. We don't evaluate them. And what I really call that is just blowing in the wind. So we don't have the conversations we need to have about who we are and what we're about. We just go about. I call that blowing in the wind.
And the last of the baker's dozen is perfectionism and fear hold us back from growth. We don't do anything because we're not going to do it unless it's going to be perfect. And sometimes it's not going to be perfect until we get all of the analysis of how much it's going to cost and how many people it's going to take and how long it's going to take. And paralysis by analysis is a cousin to perfectionism, I would say.
So we've gone through this period, that our time up to this point, talking about what gets in the way of our disciple making. So what would be a solution to this? This is really what we want to talk about. We spent this time. It's important that we spend the time because I think you and I, Sarah and I, would agree that what we've just talked about with these 13 barriers to disciple making actually become the norm for our activity, for our action, for our ministry, and not the exception. And what we want to do is to move to something different. So what would be a solution?
Well, I know the solution that most people would want is a 3-step plan to get that quick fix in place and get everything that we just talked about out of the way. But there isn't a quick fix. The solution is developing the skills to lead with courage. Now, hear us. We're on this journey with you. We have not conquered the courage building skills either. And so my hope is that you didn't hear us walking through those barriers and that you weren't beating yourself up, because what we walk through, we recognize that there's a complexity of behavior and cultural norms in what we just walked through. So if we want to lead with courage, if we want to make disciples, if we want to move beyond the behaviors and the cultural norms that we just talked about, even if there is one in your local congregation, we're going to share the first skill today. In future episodes, we'll get into other skills. And I have to admit that I haven't until recently considered, when it comes to disciple making and leadership, that this skill is absolutely necessary. But it is. And that skill is vulnerability. And now that you want to hit stop, don't listen anymore. Wait, that's not what we thought that you were going to say. You were expecting something different. So let me say this. What I'm talking about is relational vulnerability. And here's the definition that Brené Brown offers from her research. She says that vulnerability is the emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Let me say that again so you hear it. Vulnerability is the emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So as you reflect back on the 13 behaviors and cultural norms that Tim and I walked through and some of the examples that we walked through, you can see why vulnerability is important in terms of courageous leadership. Disciple making necessitates vulnerability. And before you say, okay, I don't want any of this fluff, that's not what that's not what being a leader is. Let me be the first to say there's not much about vulnerability that I really like. I'm just going to be honest, because when I read that definition, in times of uncertainty, in times of risk, in times of emotional exposure, I don't want to go there. If I'm honest, I want to be safe. I want to be certain, and I don't want to expose more than I know that I can with people that I know that I can. But that's part of the reason why we're in the situation that we're in.
So maybe what we need to say is that vulnerability is not an oversharing.
No.
I would say it's, and I think this is probably one of the barriers. It's not touchy-feely.
Nope.
It's not necessarily divulging our deepest, darkest secrets to perfect strangers, where on Sunday morning we have to turn to the person next to us and talk about what's deep in our hearts.
Nope.
I'm with you at this point. I've got great difficulty in doing those kinds of things.
And that's that is not what vulnerability is.
Right.
It is really about being willing to acknowledge that we're experiencing that emotion, and then trusting that when we step into that, we're stepping into a safe place to do that. So it would make no sense to do what you just suggested, sitting in the congregation for worship and divulging your deepest, darkest secrets to the person that you've never met sitting next to you. That's not vulnerability. That's dumb.
Well, I was getting ready to say it was stupidity, but you have to understand, and I haven't done this for several podcasts, but I've been at this for 40 plus years.
There it is.
And I actually started at a time where worship and preaching was more about pastoral care, getting into small groups, not as disciple-making groups, but as sharing groups, and getting deep down and talking about those, the kinds of things we just said, this is not what vulnerability is about, but that was what the vulnerability was at the time, was to open up and talk about and participate in that, in those kinds of ways. The vulnerability we're talking about, I think, is greater than that.
And so I think the best example and the best way that I have heard it said is that to love is to be vulnerable. And how I think about that is, if I love God and if I'm going to love my neighbor, it's going to mean that I'm going to step into a place of vulnerability because God has already met me there. And I'm simply taking the next step with God on that journey wherever we might go. And without that, without the love that comes between people, we don't have connections with people, let alone with Jesus. The more and more I reflect on it, without vulnerability, we're probably not going to be making disciples. We're going to be participating in a whole lot of the behaviors that we talked about to start with. So for the rest of our time together today, we want to invite you into practicing vulnerability. And yes, we're including ourselves. And what I want to remind you is that we're not going to get this right the first time that we try it. We're not going to get it right probably the second time that we try it. But I think about children learning to walk, and they don't do it perfectly the first time either. They try to get up and then they fall down, and they try to get up and then they fall down, and they might get up on one knee and then fall down to their bottom again, and they might do a face plant, and they keep at it. And that's what we're inviting you to do. So by way of example, as a way to practice this, let me ask you to consider a question. Where was the church that you attended as a child located? Was it in a rural area, a suburban area, or an urban community? So, Tim, why don't you answer that question?
It was in a rural area, a small town.
Okay. So I asked that question because I was with a group of denominational leaders several years ago, and that question was asked. And when it was asked, I turned to the facilitator and asked him to repeat the question and said to him, "So you're asking us to go back to when we were children, correct?" And he said, "Yeah." And the way that he said it and the face that he made, I can still see it in my mind. It was as if I was asking the dumbest question of my entire life. And at that moment, I was ashamed. And you might be thinking, you were ashamed because you thought you asked a dumb question? No. I wasn't ashamed because I thought I was asking a dumb question. I knew my question wasn't dumb. I was ashamed because I didn't have an answer to the question. Because I didn't go to church as a kid. I didn't have an answer to what he was asking. I also didn't want to say that to him because when I asked him to repeat the question, it seemed as though I was a bother, and I honestly did not want to know what his response was going to be if I said to him, "Well, I didn't have a church that I went to." So I went to the group of churches in suburban areas because I grew up in the suburbs, and that's where I lived as a child. And after we got in our groups, the facilitator asked us to go around the circle and share with the people in our group what the church was like growing up. And one by one, we went around the circles, and there were bishops and district superintendents and pastors and lay leaders and leaders from general agencies, and each one of them shared. And I could see in their eyes the nostalgia these memories were bringing about. The beloved pastor, the Sunday school class, vacation Bible school stories, the trips that they took, the smell of the building, the special seasons. They shared story after story after story, and they were beautiful stories. And I was the last in the group to share. And I looked at them and I said, "I lived in the suburbs as a child. I don't have any memories of a specific church because my family did not participate in the church." And everyone is staring at me, looking at me, and looking at one another with this look on their face as if to say, "What'd she just say?" And so I continued and said, if I had any memory of the church as a child, it was that it was an unknown exclusive club that only certain people could go, and they performed rituals and excluded people. And I said that because what I knew of church as a child was from the few times I went with my Roman Catholic friends and Lutheran friends and Baptist friends. And every time I went, there was something that I was left out of. And I never understood why my friends, these people who supposedly cared about me, would take me someplace and then tell me I couldn't do what they were doing and couldn't participate in what was happening. And so the only comparison that I could make as a child was that this place had more rules than my teacher at school had, and more ways to tell you what you couldn't do than what you could do. And I finished, and I kid you not, I felt like I was 2 inches tall. because no one, including the facilitator, considered that this denominational gathering of a group of leaders would include someone who did not grow up in the church. Now, folks, that meeting took place less than 4 years ago. And it was a meeting about vitality in the church. Oh, the irony, right? So as I think about the vulnerability of disciple making, I think about how much we assume as well-meaning, well-intended, and often misguided church people. And yes, I'm talking about all of us. So, Tim, let's return to that list where we started. Because that list where we started, I think there were at least 4 things that we talked about that happened in the scenario that I just shared that we can draw some parallels.
So one of the things you mentioned was shame. From the facilitator's tone of voice and the stares of the people in the group, you felt shame. You felt 2 inches tall.
Yeah, I mean, it was as if I was saying to the group of people, I don't believe in Jesus. And there we were at a meeting. Because I had not, that's what I felt. Because I did not have a church that I grew up in as a child. I would love to tell you that throughout the meeting that day, I kept speaking up and speaking out, and I'd love to tell you that I kept trying to help people to understand, but I didn't. And I didn't because it was clear that nostalgia was in the driver's seat and innovation and truth-telling didn't even make it into the trunk of the car, let alone in the car. So yeah, shame was all over the place. And I think the other thing that happened for me in the midst of that is I felt stupid. And as I reflect on it now, how silly is it that I felt stupid for not growing up in the life of the church? But I didn't say much the rest of the day because even though we were talking about congregational vitality, we didn't want to talk about the people who weren't in the church. Yes, now rewind and hear me say that again. We were talking about congregational vitality, but we didn't want to talk about the people who were not connected to the church. They hadn't considered that perspective. What they wanted to have a conversation about were the things that had worked for some of them 50 years ago. I didn't have anything to offer.
And that's mainly because you're not 50.
Right.
Now, part of the what we're talking about then in terms of the vulnerability is that if we feel shame and as you said, you felt stupid, then there's just the whole idea of why participate at all. There's nothing that I have to offer, so why even participate?
Right. There's no doubt in my mind that the people in that room cared deeply about the state of the church. They recognized that we had been in decline, but they weren't willing to face their own feelings and their own fear about what that meant. And the reality was my story made them uncomfortable because my story represented the challenge that we were trying to face. And the only solutions that had been presented were programmatic shoehorning solutions to get more people to participate in the church. It had nothing to do with focusing on helping people to even have a relationship with Jesus. We simply wanted to get them in the building. That was the conversation. Because if we can get them in the building, then we can get them to be members. And if we get them to be members, then we can deal with the rest of it. If you've listened to any of our podcasts, you know that that's not the way that we have talked about living into our mission of making disciples and transforming the world. We've talked about it as reaching out and receiving people, offering Christ, helping people to practice the faith and engaging in service. And so the last thing that I noticed was happening is there wasn't innovation emerging around vitality because we didn't want to have the tough conversation. Again, even though the data that was presented that day reflected my story, we didn't want to have that tough conversation.
So I'm willing to go back to what I said at the beginning and say that part of the reason we have difficulty in making disciples is that we ourselves are not disciples. We have trouble talking about Jesus. We have trouble saying that we even not only know Jesus, but that we're followers of Jesus. It seems that that may be one of the biggest barriers we have. I don't mean to continue to go back to that, but we can sit in our meetings and have all the conversations we want, but if we're not followers of Jesus, we're going to have difficulty making disciples.
Well, and I would go back to, if we're not willing to be in a place of vulnerability to be in a relationship with Jesus, no, we're not a follower of Jesus. And in a future episode, we'll talk about this. If we only focus on discipleship as knowledge about Jesus, we need to know who Jesus is, absolutely. But there's a connection to the heart and to our hands and feet that also happens. And without that connection, I don't know how love happens. I don't know how we receive the love of God. I don't know how we share the love of God. I don't know how we grow in that love. And I don't know how we help other people experience that love. And so it is the yin and the yang. If you're not vulnerable, you're not going to be a disciple. If you're not a disciple, you're not going to want to be vulnerable. It's the chicken and the egg. I hope you hear us that we don't have the market cornered on this. God gives us an opportunity for do-overs. And so I can't speak for anybody else, but I'm going to take mine and I'm going to do my best to lead in ways that help people encounter the love that I know in Jesus so that they might experience that love and share that love. And part of what I'm learning right now is that requires vulnerability. And so I want to give you some homework. We want to give you some homework.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, we've gone through the barriers. We've talked about vulnerability. Let's practice some vulnerability.
So the first thing that I want you to do is decide whose opinion matters. And I don't want you to make a laundry list. I don't want you to fill a piece of paper. I don't want you to even take a 3x3 inch Post-it note. I want you to draw a 1x1 inch square and write the names of the people whose opinion matters in that square. And yes, you only get a 1x1 inch square. And these people aren't people that are the folks who always say yes to you. And these are the people that you know are going to speak truth into your life, who love you because of who you are, as I like to say, warts and all, and they journey with you. Then I want you to let them know that they're in your square. And after you've decided who are the people whose opinion matters, and you've communicated that to them, then I want you to ask them if they'd go on a little adventure with you. And here's the adventure. You can do it right where you live. In fact, you need to do it right where you live. not in your house, but in your community. You're going to have to get outside your house to do this. I want you to go to some place in your community where there are people. And this might be a grocery store. It might be a community center. It might be the bank. It might be that you're going to run and get gas. It might be a shopping plaza that you walk into different stores. And what I want you to do is I want you to go with your person that you've identified and ask at least 5 people 2 questions. I want you to ask them what they love about your community and what needs to change. So you're going to do that with 5 people. And you're going to need to listen more than you speak. And if they're willing, ask the person that you ask those questions of if they'd be willing to have more conversation about addressing the needs that they identify in your community. And then you're going to need to ask them the best way that you could reach them. It might be that they give you an email. It might be that they say, message me on Facebook and ask if you can friend them right then and there. It might be that they give you a telephone number. It might be that they say, come back to the store here and let me know. And so you're going to have to make another trip. So let me review that again. You've decided whose opinion matters. You've told them. You've invited them on a little adventure. You've now gone out into the community. You've asked 5 people what they love about your community, what needs to change, and if they'd be willing to have another conversation. And now you're going to come back to the church and you're going to identify one person that you're going to share this homework with and invite them to do exactly what you did. And you're going to go on to another person who's in your 1 by 1 inch square and do this homework with them again. And you're going to keep doing this until everyone in leadership has been out and had a conversation with at least 5 people about what they love about your community and what needs to change in your community. And if you're thinking, okay, that's weird and I'm not sure if I want to do that, welcome to the world of leading from a place of vulnerability. That's what it's like to be human. It's going to feel weird the first time you do it, and that's okay. When I have done this, I've approached it simply by saying to folks, hey, do you mind if I ask you a question? It won't take too long. And then I just ask them, what do you love about the community? And you would be surprised how much people enjoy talking about what they love. And then you have an opportunity to say, okay, can I flip the tables on you? As soon as you start the conversation, it's a whole lot less awkward. At the end of that, when all of the leadership have been included and had an opportunity to ask those questions, then I want you to come together and share what you learned. And you should have a very rich dialogue about what you've learned about what people love about your community and what needs to change in your community. And you might even begin to identify ways that the church might be present in the community. And in the next episode, we'll tell you why we're asking you to do that and why that next step may lead you into the community.
In this podcast, we've talked about barriers to disciple making, about having those tough conversations. And at the first place, we want to encourage people to step out is with vulnerability. That makes sense. We want you to be vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, you have given us an assignment so that we can practice being vulnerable. Just having a conversation with people in the community that we may not normally have a conversation with. And that brings us then, all of this is bringing us to a place of courageous leadership, which eventually leads us to the place of being able to ask the questions that need to be asked and to have the conversations that we need to have so we can make disciples, be disciples, of Jesus Christ so our communities, our neighborhoods, our cities can become exactly what God created them to be.
And all I would add is that if we don't choose the path of courageous leadership that helps us to focus on disciple making, we're going to keep repeating the behaviors that we started with. And those things and many more have not only stood in the way, but have become the way. So every week, we invite you to go lead a movement of Jesus followers. This week is no different. Bye for now.